Receiving HF SSB on a Baofeng. Yes, you can do it. And not only SSB, but also CW and digital modes as well. You might have seen my previous videos where I received, first of all, 2 motors SSB, Whisper and CW on my Baofeng UV82. All I needed for that was a Nano VNA as a beat frequency oscillator. Then in a later video I described receiving the AM broadcast band on the same UV82. That needed a converter. That converted the incoming signal at around 1 MHz up to around 141 MHz, a frequency that can be received on the Baofeng. Right now I'm receiving amateur SSB from 7 MHz on the Baofeng UV82. That uses a converter, again a very similar circuit to what I used with the AM broadcast up converter, and a beat frequency oscillator. First of all, take a listen.
It probably works this off its own. Just more what's going on up top, I would imagine they're growing. So good stuff, mate. So how's that farming going? Is he dropping along all right, over?
This is the converter. Going from right to left is the antenna connection. Just above the middle of the screen, the blue thing is a 4.7 microhenry coil, and right here is the variable capacitor. So that's the front end that resonates on 7 MHz, but I can adjust it to cover other frequencies. Less easy to see, so I'll just move the camera. And here is the crystal oscillator. I'm using a similar arrangement to what I did for the AM broadcast. So it's a 20 MHz crystal. It's going to have a lot of harmonics, one of which is 140 MHz. And then that goes into, there's a diode mixer here, just using a germanium diode. And then I'm not any longer using a tuned circuit, or at least a trimmer capacitor and coil on the output. I've just got a 10 picofarad capacitor here and a length of wire about 5 centimeters, and I find that's enough to put in enough signal. It's just coupling into the Baofeng's handheld antenna. Now, although it's actually a frequency within the amateur 2 meter band, in this case I'm tuned to a bit above 147 because it happens to be 140 MHz plus the 7 MHz amateur signal that we're receiving. Now, a problem with that is that we're not using any shielding, so if you do happen to have a local 2 meter repeater that's on near this frequency, then you will get some breakthrough. One way to overcome that is possibly to use an alternative frequency. For instance, if your Baofeng, and most of them do, receives at 167 MHz, then that should also be okay, because you are then using the 8th multiple of our 20 MHz crystal oscillator. So we'll just tune either side. It's quite a wide tuning range, because the real tuning is done with the beat frequency oscillator.
VK2FA, Graham and Riley driving home into Newcastle from VK1NK. Over.
Now you might be able to hear that signal. That's VK2FA, who's mobile. A distance of about maybe 700 kilometres from here. And it's about 9:30 p.m. at night. Now, what this is the beat frequency oscillator. It is a ceramic resonator on 3.58 megahertz, and it covers from about 3.53 up to above 3.6. And you double that and you get most of the popular part of the 40 metre amateur band. So I'm using its harmonic to operate as a beat frequency oscillator. It's not electrically connected, but I've got a wire from its output, and that's coupling a bit of RF into near the front end. And if I move that away, now you might have heard another signal near there. We'll try and tune them in as well. Little bit of hand capacitance there.
What else can I say? The trials and telling you about that.
Taken the Porsche over to the mechanic, and he's going to have a look at the.
Now, if the signal's a bit distorted, and if it's quite strong, then you have a bit more coupling. It's quite unusual. They're actually two VK1s on adjacent frequencies in different contacts. One thing that I find is fairly critical, and I think this is because it's an FM receiver, is the coupling of the BFO. If the coupling is too loose, it's noisy like this, but if it's too tight, then that will swamp your incoming signal and it won't be so strong. So you want it at about the point where the noise mostly disappears, and maybe with a bit tighter coupling if your incoming signal is really strong. Now, this is just a one transistor variable ceramic resonator oscillator, but you can use anything that generates a small signal as the BFO. You could use a nano VNA. Main problem with the nano VNA, that's fine if you are listening to a particular fixed frequency, but not so good if you want to casually tune across the band. Whereas with this beat frequency oscillator, that's a better arrangement for that. But it can be a bit touchy. Any free running VFO would be okay.
I don't mind a good Italian tenor or something, super strong. But
Now right here, the yellow wire, that just goes from the free end of the diode, and it's a germanium diode. It then goes to this 10 picofarad capacitor. Handheld antenna is reasonably close to it. It can even be 20 centimeters away, but I like it fairly close. That minimises any noise you might get.
This notorious gang called the Paddo Boys, the Paddington Boys, came over and they wrecked the joint. But because they knew the singer, we were left alone, luckily.
Now you might need to turn the volume control up to nearly maximum, as the signal or the audio level of the signal won't be as much compared to if you were hearing an FM signal. Just as an experiment, we'll try and do what I mentioned before. We'll try 167 point, say 160, 157.
1, 6, 7, 1, 6, 7.
And there, 167, 160, around that area. There's the signal that we were tuning in before. It's actually not quite as strong. Now here's some Morse code. VK2IR. And he's talking to, I think it was a K6, who I can't hear. .339, so he's not very strong in VK2. Now I've got the FT817. I'm just using it to calibrate or to align the BFO. If you're using a nano VNA, which should be accurate by itself, you won't need to do that. But anyway, we'll get it onto 7074. What you're seeing now is reception of FT8 on 7 MHz through this Baofeng arrangement. I'm not using any audio cable. It's just speaker to microphone coupling with the Baofeng about 30 centimeters away from the computer, which has an internal microphone, so yeah, it can work that way. As you can see, there's some DX appearing on the screen, 3D2, HL, and also some locals. Now in each 15-second burst you might have 2 or 3 stations appearing, which is not necessarily all the stations that will be on FT8 at the moment. Just for comparison, we'll disconnect the makeshift Baofeng converter BFO arrangement, and we'll just now receive with the FT817. I'll just change the antenna over to a proper antenna like I was using before, and that's now the audio coming out of the FT817. Now just compare something. You might have seen there 3D2 USU was at 2 dB. With the previous reception of them, with the Baofeng arrangement, it was -10. So the 817 arrangement, with the much better selectivity and receive performance overall, is definitely superior. But as you just saw, you can still get FT8 with the Baofeng and BFO arrangement, and even DX FT8 signals on 7 MHz. This is the circuit for the converter. On the left is the crystal oscillator at 20 MHz. If you had one of those crystal oscillator modules, you could possibly use that instead. It's using just an ordinary BC548 transistor, could be a 2N3904. And if we look closer up, you'll see there's a 33 picofarad capacitor in series with the crystal. If you wanted to change the frequency a little bit, like to get it exactly on 20 MHz, then you might want to vary that value. You could potentially use say a 10 to 50 picofarad trimmer, something like that, in series with the crystal. That will help you align it to be spot on and to be good for the frequency readout on the Baofeng. Not essential though for reception, provided you're willing to tolerate a bit of frequency difference. And bear in mind though that they do multiply, so if you're 5 kHz off at 20 MHz, then at 140 MHz, then it would be much more than that. It would be 70 kHz off. So yeah, if you can, try and get it spot on to 20 MHz. If you don't have a 20 MHz crystal, like if you have one for 24, then you could still use it, but the frequency that you're tuned to on the Baofeng will be different. In this case, 20 megahertz crystal, a lot of harmonics coming out of the oscillator, including one that we want at 140 megahertz, and that is coupled into the mixer that you see here. And if you are wanting to tune in 7 megahertz signals like this converter is for, then you would set your HT to a bit above 147 megahertz. There's the diode about in the center. It's a germanium diode, an OA95. I suggest using that if you can, but I did try a silicon diode, a 1N4148, and that worked as well. Not quite as good, but it did work. So the lack of a germanium diode is no reason not to build this converter. In the middle of the screen is the front-end tuned circuit. A 4.7 microhenry RF choke, looks like a fat resistor, and there are 2 turns of enamelled copper wire like you get from an old transformer round over to the middle, and that is just connected to the antenna. And you do need a good outdoor antenna. This is not a particularly sensitive converter. I do hear a bit of noise when I connect the antenna up, which is a good sign, but if you're in a very quiet location you may not hear band noise on this. A refinement may include a RF preamp, preferably with additional front-end tuned circuits to reduce breakthrough from broadcast stations. So we've got the desired signal coming in via the 4.7 microhenry RF choke. In parallel is a variable capacitor. It goes up to 160 picofarad, because around 100 picofarad that's where it resonates at 7 megahertz. I suggest you're really desirable to make it variable. If you don't have a variable capacitor, you could try a fixed 100 picofarad disc ceramic capacitor, but I don't really recommend it, because you really want to be exact on frequency with this. You don't have any gain to spare. There's no actual gain in this circuit at all. It's just a passive diode mixer. The output of the diode connects to a loop. You can see there's a loop that I've got round, or if you look at the diagram, it's just going over the end of the HT's rubber ducky, and then a 10 picofarad capacitor to earth. That can be a disc ceramic. It's about 5 centimeters of wire. You might want to experiment with it. I initially had a trimmer capacitor of up to about 25 picofarad here, and I couldn't get much of a peak. But you might want to experiment again. Maybe I didn't have the wire the correct length to provide the required inductance, and anyway, I didn't really need a peak. There was sufficient signal here for it to be fully quieting and coupling into the Baofeng. That is tuned, as I mentioned before, a bit above 147 megahertz if you're receiving the 7 megahertz emitter band. Now, if you wanted to have this operating on 3.5 megahertz, I haven't tried it in this circuit, but I would suggest changing the 4.7 microhenry inductor to 22 microhenry. That will resonate with the variable capacitor here at 3.5 to 4 megahertz. And as well, if you're wanting to listen to 14 megahertz signals or 10 megahertz signals, then you could actually do that just by leaving the arrangement for 7 megahertz in. I think the range would be something like 5 or 6 up to 15 megahertz, something like that. But note that the sensitivity isn't very good, and that's more important at higher frequencies like 14 megahertz. However, I did try this with FT8 on 14 megahertz and did detect some signals. Now, the most important thing is your beat frequency oscillator. You saw what I used, which was a 1 transistor ceramic resonator oscillator. You could use a nano VNA, and you can set that up to your exact frequency, like on FT8 for 7 megahertz, 7074. But with the nano VNA, as I mentioned before, it's a bit harder to adjust its frequency. So if you can, I suggest some easily adjustable VFO. That provides your beat frequency oscillator injection, and it's important that you vary the coupling. If you're overcoupling, then the BFO signal can swamp the incoming signal and you don't hear much coming out. But if the coupling is too loose, then it's just hissy and you won't hear it either. So yeah, find the amount of coupling that causes the hiss to almost disappear, and that will be about right.
Actually, Mr. Robertson might be around. He's at Erechuka, a couple out there.